Hi there, everybody, and welcome to Serious Sunday. It is Saturday evening, as usual. So, how are you doing? We had a very interesting week in just sort of new things going down in sort of the game space. We had the release of Doom very recently, which was pretty cool. I've been hearing good things about it, though I haven't quite played the game yet. And also the announcement trailer for Civilization 6, which was pretty big news. I know that I've always been kind of a fan of the Civilization games for quite a long time, so it's good to see another one coming down the pipe, because it's been a while since Civ 5 came out. I know a couple of my coworkers are also pretty excited about the game. I've got one who's already kind of tentatively looking at pre-ordering the game. I'm not going to go quite that far myself. I'm usually a sort of a late adopter of the new Civ games, but there you go. What are you going to do? So, anyway, one of the things that kind of came out when Civ 6's trailer sort of dropped is something that has kind of bothered me a little bit about sort of just the gaming public in general over the last however many years, and that is the immediate sort of habit that people have of jumping on top of games that have sort of a shift in style. And sort of just, I can understand getting away from, or sort of being upset about a game getting away from sort of a very established stylistic, method of showing their game off. But some games are conducive to that sort of thing, and I think that many people sort of get bothered by that. I saw that when I was working on Roller Coaster Tycoon 3. I was part of the team that did the iOS version of that when I worked at Frontier for a short period of time. And although it's a fairly old game, back when it came out in 2004, there were so many people who were kind of decrying the look of the game being a lot more needlessly cartoony than it was in comparison to, oddly enough, the tiny little sprites that were in Roller Coaster Tycoon 2. You had a similar sort of issue with Diablo 3's release, well, not release, but it's sort of teaser and very early trailers and screenshots where people were saying that it looks much too colorful, it's way too bright, and people were like talking about like unicorns farting rainbows out of their asses and stuff like that. And I can totally understand to a certain extent people kind of having problems with the way that things look. We're sort of creatures of habit, and we also kind of get used to one specific thing. But that said, it's like people aren't even really willing to give certain things a chance. Now, I'm not going to say that unequivocally this is everybody on the internet, and as usual, it is the internet again, so people are kind of very likely to just be complaining for the sake of complaining because anonymity makes asses of us all, right? But that said, I don't know, I'm personally a fan of the new sort of art style that it seems to be adopting. I'm not going to say that I think it's perfect, but I don't see the reason for all the vitriol that it seems to be getting. One of the main arguments that I see, and this is something that I see quite a bit whenever something goes from somewhat more realistic style to a little bit more stylized, maybe a little bit more cartoony, is that people immediately jump in and say that it looks like a quote-unquote a shitty mobile game, right? Where people immediately equate something with a slightly lower poly count and maybe less detailed textures as being this sort of needlessly thought of as bad mobile quote-unquote style to it. I don't even quite understand why looking slightly cartoony or looking somewhat cartoony has to equal mobile, but I don't know, people find some way to turn anything into a negative if they try hard enough, right? So there you go. So yeah, people have been looking at the new Civilization 6 screenshots. There's only screenshots out in the market right now. There was that trailer, quote unquote. I don't know. I thought it was basically just really a teaser because it wasn't showing much of anything. And when you consider that they had screenshots, well, I would have liked to have seen some stuff in motion, but there you go. It's probably still very early in, well, can't be that early in development. I think the game's supposed to come sometime late in the year, but yeah, it's early enough probably that they're not quite willing to show off screenshots, or knowing the general sort of release pattern that games tend to have, maybe they're just waiting on showing actual animated shots of what goes on in the game, actual game footage, until a little bit later in the marketing cycle, which is totally normal for companies like this to do. But anyway, my thoughts about the effectiveness of the trailer aside, really all they needed to do was say, hey, we're making another Civilization, and people would have been champing at the bit enough for that. So whatever, right? Anyway, what people have been really latching onto is the screenshots, and I'll post them up right here, right now. And that is like, I don't know. So let's break it down very briefly. So we've got one of the things that I think that I noticed the most, and I spend a lot of time on Reddit, is somebody had posted an image of the Civilization 5 horses next to an image of the Civilization 6 horses. Now, I mean, there are some innate problems with the way that this is being displayed, because in Civilization 5, because it's an existing game, because it's something that you can just load up and take a screenshot of, all you have to do is zoom in and take a picture, and there you go. You have your horses, and you can zoom in fairly close, as these games, it's fairly obvious. Whereas with Civilization 6, all we have is a screenshot, so somebody kind of had to zoom in and take a look at these things. So there's this thing called LOD, level of detail, which is essentially the amount of detail that goes into a specific image or texture or mesh, usually displayed at a certain distance from the screen. A certain distance of zoom. So like if you're looking nice and close up to somebody, then you can see them at full detail, whereas if they're further away, in order to save resource cost, because it's not going to be able to display the overly like high detailed textures and meshes at that distance anyway, they'll actually swap out the model to something smaller, something that has less polygons and has less detailed textures, which will in turn allow the game to use less memory on that. There's a whole lot of memory sort of optimization tricks that these exist with. If you want a really good example of LOD, well, I mean, I hate to keep on going back to things that I worked on, but Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 actually has a slider where you can change the draw distance of things. Like you can zoom all the way in, and then you can bring the draw distance way down, and you'll actually be able to tell very closely what the 3 different LODs that they use are. But I mean, another sort of famous example of this one is in the original Mass Effect. There was a problem, I guess, when they released the game where Garrus, actually, even when he was close up, was actually using his medium LOD model and textures. So he always looked a little bit off compared to a lot of other people, even possibly some other Turians in the game. But I digress. Anyway, so we have this image of Civilization 6, which possibly could be using a lower LOD model and or textures. But that said, that's only one small thing that you can latch onto. One of the other problems that the people were having were that the textures were inherently less quote-unquote detailed. There was less fine detail within the individual textures, and it was more colorful, and it was more sort of cartoony. If Civilization was like Age of Empires, then this new version was like Settlers 7, right? It was noticeably more cartoony and noticeably less sort of shooting for realism, which in my opinion is the smart move to make, especially if your game is on a slightly lower budget. And despite how popular Civilization is, it's not going to bring in the kinds of profits unless you have a lot of people who are buying all of the DLC packs. And my goodness, Civilization 5 had a lot of DLC packs. But that said, it's not as profitable. It's still a niche game, even if it's a huge niche game, Not as many people are probably going to be playing it. because a lot of people recognize that sort of turn-based, long play strategy type game is not really necessarily for them, and that's fine. I mean, you don't expect something like Crusader Kings or something like that either to be overly sort of high value or sort of high selling. It's just the way of things. It's not a mainstream genre, or it's not as mainstream as as it once was. So yeah, I mean, it's almost definite that the budget is going to be lower than some other projects that you might see around now. Like, I'm sure that Doom spent a whole lot more than Civilization is, for example. Just throwing, something else out that came out this week that's very easy to kind of think about if you're watching this when it came out. So, yeah, in comparison to Civilization 5, Civilization 6 looks cartoony, quote unquote. This is a problem that people have. I was saying that, yeah, it is a smart choice, because one of the things that you'll notice if you continue to play games that become slightly older, not even like an old game, but something that came out like 3 years ago or 4 years ago. Mass Effect is a great example of this. If you compare the visuals of the original Mass Effect 1, against the visuals of Mass Effect 3, or if you compare the visuals of the first Uncharted game versus the fourth Uncharted game, which also just came out very, very recently, you'll note some big sweeping changes that have been made to these things, and they always look super realistic and awesome when they come out, because we don't have a frame of reference of something that looks better. But when something better does come around, all of a sudden it doesn't look that great. This is just sort of, it's just the way of things. When you shoot for realism, you can attain the level of realism that people have managed to attain to this point, but the minute it gets surpassed by something else, all of a sudden that volume of realism is no longer something. It's just no longer as good, quote unquote, as perhaps somebody might have originally thought. You look at it and it looks dated, right? Whereas, go for something like Team Fortress 2 or Overwatch, which also we just went through beta, and I played and it was fantastic and I loved it, and I'm definitely going to be playing a lot of this game. But they are again sort of cartoony. They are stylized. I think stylized graphics is the term that I use the most when sort of talking about these types of things. They consciously made the decision not to go with realism, but to go with something that would be enduring, something that would last, something that in 5 years, in 10 years, is going to look just as good as it did when it came out. Team Fortress 2 came out in 2007, at the end of 2007, so that's almost a 10-year-old game, but it still looks great because it has an established art style. That doesn't have to change very much. It looks the way it does. And that's fine. I mean, maybe some of the levels are a little bit more sparse when you compare Team Fortress to Overwatch, which I guess is probably a close enough to comparison, although Team Fortress's models are very stylized, very angular. But that said, they still have a very specific look, and those looks endure, and those looks are just fine when you play them later, and that is a thing that I think actually a lot of people are starting to grasp, are starting to sort of grab onto, because especially in the console space, although, I mean, yes, I recognize that Civilization is a PC game, but all over the games market in general, low poly, quote unquote, or lower polygon counts and less realistic visuals for a game have a better chance of being regarded as visually impressive as time goes on. Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker, cartoony as hell on purpose, looks fantastic. I mean, Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword and stuff, they also look fantastic, but that is because, again, it's all stylized. It looks good. People had so many problems with the Wind Waker when it originally came out as well, because they wanted basically the Link that they got in Twilight Princess, and instead they got, Kid Link or Child Link or whatever the name is that he officially has from the Wind Waker. Now, in sort of hindsight, Child Link and just the visual style of Wind Waker is lauded as possibly one of the best looking games to even ever come out on the GameCube. For good reason, too. It looks fantastic. Stylized graphics are great. It's a smart choice. It's something that you probably should do. Now, back to the idea of Civilization changing sort of visually between Civilization 5 and Civilization 6 and looking a little bit more cartoony. At the end of the day, this is a game that needs to be readable. Readable, by which I mean when you look at the screen, you have to instantly be able to tell what's going on the screen at any given point in time. And it has to be something that is sort of easy to look at over a long, long period of time. And I'm not saying that Civilization 5 in any way was not great to look at from the very beginning. I love the game. I continue to play it to this day, even though, it is quite a time investment, so I don't play it a lot. But I think that people are jumping on something for no good reason at this point. And every single time I see a franchise with this, come out with a screenshot where it looks like they're trying to create something that's going to visually it's going to look good and it's going to feel good over the long run, and it's no longer trying to compete with the ultra realism that is starting to cost us millions upon millions of dollars in development fees, or development costs, I guess I should say. People get pissed off. People have a really bad attitude about these kinds of things, and I find that unfortunate. And I think that it's something that, ideally, if we continue to, I just hope that we see a little bit more acceptance of this kind of thing, because in the long run, people are going to look back at these and think, and they're going to wonder, well, they're not going to wonder why, but they're going to think that this kind of a, temper tantrum about the visuals of a game evolving and starting and going in a slightly different direction, and only necessarily a slightly different direction. I would be much less happy about Civilization if they quote-unquote dumbed it down, right? Got rid of a lot of the mechanics that it has that make it great, that those sort of 4X tropes that it follows and actually that it established in many cases. That would be a problem, theoretically. Like, that could potentially be a valid reason, I think, for people to be kind of up in arms. But we know nothing about the gameplay for the game just yet. We should wait to see what else the game has to offer before we start getting pissed off about visuals for the game. And that's my little mini rant for today. That's my serious Sunday. That was me getting serious about just sort of people's immediate knee-jerk reactions to visuals in games, especially trailers. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that this was interesting to you. If you're interested in hearing more about this, I'm very happy to do a topic that goes a little bit more in depth into the the styles, how stylized games work and that sort of things. But you let me know if you want to hear that. You can leave me a comment right down below. I'm always very happy to hear from people. I will respond to you. That is my style. And also, hey, if you want to hear more, we also do regular, much more well-researched and much less podcasty versions of these types of shows on every Thursday, and it's our show Thursdev. So if you want to see more of that, we got that for you. We also do our regular Let's Plays as always. Feel free to hit that big red subscribe button down below. I would love if you did. Even if you don't, though, thank you again for listening. I really appreciate each and every one of you coming by every time. Thank you very much. Talk to you next time.